This is broadcast number 557, August the 9th, 1982. First, a disclaimer for the station. Everything I say here, I am totally responsible for. The opinions stated on World Watchers are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of KAZU or its staff. That should make it clear. I stand by what I say, and they are not responsible for these names that I mention on the air. Also, I want to remind you that they always need funds. There's always fundraising for the station. This is a listener-sponsored station, and any checks you send in are appreciated. Also, I read in the paper that KKUP is having trouble. That's up at Cupertino. They carry World Watchers another evening up there, and I understand their rent is going up, and they may have to go off the air. So for those of you that listen to World Watchers up there, please help support the station. They're going to have a meeting. I don't know how they're going to be able to make it with that $450-month rent, but help them if you can and come up with ways to go to hearings and see if you can help them to have the station continue for all the programs that are on there, not only for World Watchers. Now, there are two books out. I haven't read either of them, but one of these books is by Thomas Findley. It's called Famous Last Words. And the other book is by Steve Shagan called The Circle. The Famous Last Words and The Circle. And they're about international plots involving large groups of people in government, organized crime, and in the military working together. I haven't read either one of them yet, but I will get them as soon as possible. When I get them, or there's talk shows where the authors are on the air and you can call in and talk with them. One is called The Circle by Steve Shagan, S-H-A-G-A-N. I missed him on KGO this last week, but I'll pick him up somewhere else. He wrote the book The Formula. That was the story of I.G. Farben, the Chase Manhattan, the secrecy of the oil problems, the monopoly of oil, and that was a good movie. It didn't get too much attention, but it was an interesting movie and a good book. Now he's come out with a book called The Circle, and he describes the characters in this book as what are seemingly unconnected events and people in the news. I'm reading a book review from the San Francisco Chronicle. This may be a disclaimer of a sort for the publisher because both of these presidents are very much part of this inner circle and have to know about these things because they are the leader of the country that is manipulating these particular agencies and persons. But in the book, The Circle, they go into clandestine meetings underneath the White House in what is like the war room, where assassinations are plotted, where they shift to mafia meetings in Mexico, Las Vegas, and Sicily. You see Paul Laxalt, Senator Laxalt, run as manager of Ronald Reagan's campaign and has a long history in Nevada, the Vegas connections there to the President of the United States. This author says all of this is linked and attempts to tell a story of these various characters of the mafia, the Korean Gate, again, Henry Kissinger, and various presidents of the United States and the plans for murders, narcotics, traffic, and so forth. The review of the book said Shagan shows his intention to expose, and this is the important thing, in quotes, the permanent, faceless, non-elected government in Washington and other countries that through their manipulation of elected officials and their partnership with the underworld and big business and their secret buildup of military armaments and nuclear weaponry are leading us to the edge of extermination. Now, again, there's a disclaimer in the review, I guess, by the author. He says it's not by design, but by accident and mismanagement. And what I've tried to show through my years of research, and I just hit upon these interconnecting webs when I studied and began to find out who killed John Kennedy, I came up with the same cast of characters that are in this particular book, The Circle. I think that these events are planned, and the two words that are left out of the review are coup d'etat and assassinations. He says through the non-elected government officials and faceless people in Washington. The leaders of our country are there because when the elected officials don't suit the ruling clique that are manipulating behind the scenes and in the basement of the White House, they can be murdered, such as John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Adlai Stevenson, or they could get rid of Hubert Humphrey and poison or give cancer or cause accidents to happen, to get rid of anybody that doesn't fit in to the overall design and plan. I will read the book, but this author is around lecturing around the country, and if you can hear him, Steve Shagan, The Circle. Now, the other book along the same lines is a rave review. It was reviewed in the New York Times and also in the San Francisco Examiner. It's called Famous Last Words by Timothy Findley. And this book review says, make room on your bookshelf. This is similar to Catch-22, Gravity's Rainbow, and so forth. Famous Last Words is the story of the history of the world the way it should be. And according to this book reviewer, they said this book isn't for anybody who is satisfied with William Shire's Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Intimating, as I have said for a long, long time, that these kind of books, and the book by Mr. Tolan called Adolf Hitler, are fiction. They're not the true way that history came down. Now, this author claims that there's a clique that began in 1924, or at least the review says, up through the Nuremberg trial and on beyond that, a clique of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Mussolini's relatives, Count Ciano, Charles Lindbergh, von Ribbentrop, a political group that plotted to impose a political and social order of their own taste. Now, this also is true. There was a group in Great Britain and in Italy, basically the monarchy, that were displaced, the fear of the revolution in Russia taking over, taking away their thrones. The ruling clique got together and set up a system whereby they could topple other governments and set up a network mainly behind the corporation of I.G. Farben in Europe, America, South America. And when the war was over, they continued the kind of intent they had, and I use the expression, to make the world safe for feudalism. And this book is the story of what happens to history when wars are over. The review says that the first casualty of a war is truth. What history we are allowed to have is an officially approved history, the victor's history. The losers are not welcome to browse through the victor's foreign ministry in order to make their case. I give the example of after John Kennedy was murdered, a lot of the information was locked up for our lifetime in the National Archives, and when the second investigation was begun several years ago, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, more information was locked up for 50 years. And researchers who worked with the House Select Committee had to swear to secrecy, never to relay what they heard or saw, what was covered up, and so forth. So there are now two books, Famous Last Words by Timothy Findley and The Circle by Shagan, and those two books are incorporating the historic overview, the history of the world the way it really is, the way it is manipulated behind the scenes and not so much behind the scenes. The important thing is that if you read the paper every day and if you read the books that are published and follow the news, these people that are doing the manipulating are more visible every day, or we're more conscious of them. And those are the people that I try to talk about on these broadcasts and call attention to not only what's happening to them, but what they are doing to us. And by us, I mean the planet Earth. Now, in another week or two, I'm going to go into some more detail about some serious murders and corporate struggles taking place right now. Some very important articles have come out in the last few weeks. But when the upper echelon begins killing each other, you have to be more careful. They go after us and they go after labor unions. But now there is a large series. There are a series of people being murdered, the multimillionaire class struggling at the top to get to that top pole or to cut off information that people shouldn't have. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal just this last week, July 20th, 1982. Change of fortune, a proxy battle builds up. And this is the battle between Bear Stearns Group and Global Natural Resources. Now, I'll do more on that later, but before they get into the article, the Wall Street Journal, they make note that they said to add a morbid note to the forthcoming clash of proxy and stockholders, the company director who controlled the largest single block of the company's stock, that was 1.2 million shares, fell to his death from a New York hotel window April the 16th, 1982. That man was Erskine Carter from Toronto, a lawyer. I didn't clip the articles at the time. I don't even remember seeing it. He had 1.2 million shares of World Resources. Now, that one article from the Wall Street Journal brings in the who's who of the last era, many important names. The Warburg Bank in Germany, the M.M. Warburg, Brinkman, Wirtz and Company German Bank, Frank Beatty from Summit, New Jersey, Robert Vesco, Bernie Cornfeld, the Global Resources Corporation, James Ling from Texas, the Texas International Instruments, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum. This is a battle for the entire oil and energy of the Canadian Arctic. And the battle became exposed when the attorney with the large block of stocks flew out the window in New York City, and the 1.2 million shares, the voting proxy cards, went to the Bernie Cornfield gang as opposing the New Jersey Robert Vesco. That's the old investment overseas, fighting each other at the highest corporate levels. Now, I will do more on the airplane crash of Charter Oil. The president of Charter Oil, the vice president, the senior vice president went down a helicopter over Ireland. Again, this involves Robert Vesco, Billy Carter, Libya, and Arm & Hammer, the common denominator again through this case. And, of course, the unsolved murder of the former chairman of Lockheed and his wife and the housekeeper in Pennsylvania, the murder of Roberto Calvi, the president of the Banco Ambrosiano that began 4 London banks and 250 world banks to be trembling and shaking. And then Jocelyn Cadbury, a multimillionaire in London, was shot last week, August the 2nd. And he's a member of Parliament. He comes from the Schweppes family and Candy family. Very conservative. He disagreed with Margaret Thatcher's policies, and he was shot outside his home. And then the body of a multimillionaire, Peter Richmond, the textile tycoon, was found off Long Island with 2 anchors and a gun tied to his side. He's disappeared in November. So besides the secretary, Roberto Calvi, you have the murder of the Toronto lawyer with all the shares to World Resources, the voting proxy cards, the executives of Charter Oil, the former head of Lockheed, Roberto Calvi, the president of a bank in Italy, a multimillionaire in London, and a textile tycoon in New England from Stamford, Connecticut. And there are common denominators running through these, so we have to watch these, and I'll do more on them later, but they really take a lot of time by themselves, and there's other stories I want to get caught up and not lose track of, because I've been doing so much about the Italian banks and the effect that they will have on the American banks later. Or I know they will have. I do want to update you every week. We're doing an update on the FRITZ KRAEMER story, Kramer versus Kramer. Many of you listeners are too young to remember the Rin Tin Tin movies. When we were young, we went to the movie on Saturday, and there was a scene where the movie left off, and you had to go back the next week to pick it up. It was an ongoing series. Well, I have to update you on Kramer versus Kramer. 2 weeks ago, I read you a letter I got from Palestine from the Archive Center that they had no information concerning Hitler's chief of staff, Fritz Kramer. When World War II was over, they said they had no information on Hitler's chief of staff, Fritz Kramer, even though he was a prisoner at the Dachau trials. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He got off with the help of American lawyers and Senator Joe McCarthy and the Georgetown Group. He took a disappearance and hasn't been seen in any history book since that date. 2 weeks ago, I talked about him. Last week, I mentioned a letter I got from the Army Intelligence and Security Command wanting to, I asked them for information about our American Fritz Kramer, the German who recruited Henry Kissinger and took him to the Battle of the Bulge, and was 40 years old. He had several doctor's degrees, one from Germany, one from Italy. Well, this week I got a letter from the Defense Investigative Service. It was a restricted delivery. I had to go to the post office and sign it. It was a return receipt request, and it was certified. It was a triple letter from the Defense Investigative Service saying that they were giving me certain information that I asked about F.G. Kramer, my request, and other information. Some was withheld, and some more would come later out of St. Louis, Missouri. They couldn't answer my questions. The first page they sent was completely blank. It had the name KRAEMER, Fritz Gustav Anton KRAEMER, and he was inducted into the United States Army May 21st, 1943. This is the fellow whose wife and baby are living with his parents in Nazi Germany. It is the height of the war, 1943. In January, Hitler was retrenching and ready to go underground, and by May, this German KRAEMER was inducted into the United States Army. And 1 month later, he was put into Army intelligence. He was sent to Camp Lee, Virginia, Camp Ritchie, Maryland, and then he recruited Henry Kissinger at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. Now, the third page of Fritz Gustav Anton KRAEMER is an interesting story that does not answer my question, and I have written and asked for some more details. But it gives you a pretty good picture of Mr. KRAEMER. From 20 September 1944, now that is just 2 months before the Battle of the Bulge. It was at the time of the Arnhem Battle, the betrayal at Arnhem, where double agents were giving information to the American and Dutch, were being slaughtered there, and the Germans went on through Arnhem. And this is when Henry Kissinger was taken to Europe with Fritz Gustav Anton KRAEMER from 20th September 1944 to 18 April 1945. Now that the war was over May 8th, 1945, so this is 3 weeks before the war was over. Private KRAEMER, Fritz KRAEMER, served in 7 countries. This may be as a shocker to you. He was in Scotland, he was in the United States, he was Scotland, he was England, he was in France, he was in Belgium, he was in Holland, and he was in Germany. So when the war was over, he could be in Germany, where he was picked up for that quick trial at Dachau. He was in Germany at the end of the war. Now, he was in the 84th Infantry Division, and he was a battle clerk. He was temporarily given a second lieutenant appointment, temporarily, in April of 45. And in 1948, this is when the other KRAEMER is beginning in the War Department and the National Security Council of the United States. The subject was appointed a first lieutenant and went to inactive status. Now, I wrote back following this letter asking for the exact dates that he entered these particular countries and when he left them. When did he go to Scotland? When did he leave it? When did he go to England? And so forth. I'm not sure how many privates went to 7 countries at the height of the war from September 1944 until April 1945. Now, Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, was working with Allen Dulles in April of 1945, getting ready to come to the United States to turn the OSS into the CIA, which I said became the American Gestapo. And you'll see more of that in the next months and years to come as they begin to tighten the vise. But this particular fellow was in 7 different countries, and so I want to know more. They did send me another sheet on Fritz Gustav Anton KRAEMER, and most of it was blank pages, 2 blank pages, just that he went in the Army in May 43 and was transferred to military intelligence of June 43, and by 1944 was in 7 countries. So I'll be getting more from St. Louis, Missouri. I got another letter saying that they were still looking up the information on the dates of where he was, and hopefully by next week I'll have that for you. Now, in the Executive Intelligence Review, a magazine that's put out, they are always hammering at Fritz KRAEMER. They were the first publications to call attention to this person, and there's a long article, just this last issue, June the 1st, 1982. Henry Kissinger boasts of 3 decades of treason. And again, this issue goes into the fact that Henry Kissinger was drafted in the Army in 1943 in the Armed Forces, and he was soon adopted by Fritz KRAEMER, a supporter of the pro-fascist pan-European Union of the Venetian Habsburgs. And he belonged to the counts and the royal families of Venice. Those were the black oligarchy, those were the royalty that formed the international fascist leagues that are so far right that the very conservatives look like they're left. He was picked up, Henry Kissinger was adopted by this particular group, and KRAEMER took him to Europe. Well, for KRAEMER to be in an American uniform as a private traveling to all these countries and putting Henry Kissinger right there in Europe when the war was over. This article on Kissinger says that he got a job as a driver interpreter for a general in the intelligence division where KRAEMER was an officer. Now, KRAEMER was temporarily, he was a private, but the Army says he was just given a temporary officer's uniform. So the truth is that he really wasn't an American officer at all. He was dressed as one, and when they got him out of the Army, they gave him a officer's commission. When he was severed out of the Army, it wasn't as an officer, he was a private at the time. And then this Executive Intelligence Review reminds people, the readers, of Kissinger's treason as the Butcher of Chile. He ousted the Allende government in 1973 and set up the entire Latin American as well as the Southeast Asian genocidal policies. If any of you saw the movie Missing, there's a very sad scene almost at the end when the coffin of Charles Horman is coming home, and there is a mention in there of Kissinger and of Nazis. And that's why I keep corresponding and trying to find out if that Fritz KRAEMER in the disguise was Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER, because they were meeting with the same people as soon as the war was over and ever since the war was over. Now, I mentioned on the broadcast several weeks ago, for the last 2 or 3 weeks, July the 12th, 2 weeks ago, that Mehmet Agca, the fellow that shot at the Pope, who had assistance, was helping tell who shot the Pope with him. He was beginning to talk about the involvement of the conspiracy. Over there in Europe, they recognize conspiracies. In the United States, we still have the lone assassin. July the 12th, Agca, according to the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner and other news stories, was beginning to tell who helped him with a plot to shoot the Pope. And a week later, July 26th, I mentioned that there was an article in a magazine called Eagle Times linking the men who shot the Pope, Agca and his co-workers, to the organization Permindex, the same people that were behind the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and many other people. Well, this week, the Los Angeles Times has an article, Rebel French Prelate Seeks Reconciliation with the Pope. The radical Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, Lefebvre, the fellow mentioned in publications and that I've had on the air, who was behind the Spanish priest who attempted to murder John Paul II, again with a bayonet. That was May the 12th, just a few months ago. This fellow that tried to kill the Pope in Portugal was a protege of the Bishop Lefebvre of France. This bishop is much further right, the John Paul II, again, if that's possible, and he has resigned this last week from the leadership of his far-right group. The prelate, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, has resigned from his organization because now that the discussion of his role in ordaining the man and training the man who tried to stab the Pope in May is out, and Agca is talking about the other shooting attempt. He's come for reconciliation with the Pope. He's come to apologize. He stepped down from his organization. It's called the Society of Priests, and he's against the heresy of modernism. He thinks that the Catholic Church is too modern, and he had ordained and trained and worked with the fellow that tried the last stabbing, and also with Agca. It's a far right-wing Nazi group trained by the werewolves, Hitler's Youth, the same group that have worked with Fritz KRAEMER and Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. That inner circle of the very vicious assassination team. The French prelate has gone for reconciliation. He stepped down, and he has wanted to see the Pope this week and apologize. If he stepped down, somebody else stepped up. This week, many of you may have seen a big promotion for Ronald Reagan's secretary. President Reagan announced in Des Moines, Iowa, that he will promote Helene von Damm to be the president's personal representative in the White House. She will replace E. Pendleton James, and she gets a high appointment with Ronald Reagan. Now, this woman came from Austria. She worked with the Reinhard Gehlen operation. She worked with Otto von Bolschwing, who was Adolf Eichmann's superior. She married a man named von Damm, who's a banker in Europe. She's now married to a fellow in New Jersey. Helene von Damm came to California in 1976 when Reagan became the governor. She sat for 4 years next to him and reinforced the Nazification policies throughout this state. Now she was placed in the Sacramento offices by von Bolschwing through the organization TCI. And when Reagan went on to Washington, she had the room next to the Oval Office. Now she's going to get a big salary and be right in the White House. And one of her jobs is to pacify the Jewish organizations. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times in 1981, Helene von Damm, Someone Special, and it tells about her life in Austria and how she came to the United States. She married Christian von Damm, a German international banker, in 1970 and divorced him in 1978. It would be interesting and mandatory to know, and I'm going to write to the White House this week, and I'll give you the answer on the air when I get it. What bank does her husband work for in Germany, Christian von Damm in Germany? And is it linked to the Global Resources story that I'm going to do for you probably next week, that Wall Street Journal, that shocking story of German banks and the Canadian Arctic Circle and the resources of the Northern Arctic. This von Damm married a fellow who's helping her now with the Jewish question, and she's trying to placate the Jews going around campaigning in New Jersey. This is identical to Adolf Eichmann and learning Hebrew and studying Herzl and going to Palestine, and von Bolschwing going to Israel and being kicked out as a Nazi spy in 1936, and then going up to Holland. Von Damm's role, one of her roles, is to work with the Jewish community, and her husband, she says her new husband, is working very hard to get support for the Jewish community. Her target is the Jewish community, and yet she comes in right through Hitler's chief of intelligence of the Eastern Division, Adolf Eichmann. So she's a woman to watch because she's now been promoted to a very high salary and position. Now, one more story before we take the break on the hour. New York Times has an article, Political Shift Illustrated by Moderate Departure. This is Leslie Gelb. And he uses the example of Bobby Inman, Admiral Bobby Inman, leaving the CIA as deputy director, Alexander Haig leaving the State Department, and General Jones leaving the Pentagon. Now, Inman left the CIA because Edwin Wilson came home, and if Inman were to stay in there and the House Committee of Intelligence were to investigate Edwin Wilson, which I doubt they can ever really do, and Frank Turple and George Corcola, he headed Task Force 157, worked with Henry Kissinger in the murder of Allende, worked with George Bush when he was director of the CIA, headed the assassination teams. The reason Inman stepped down isn't because the moderates are departing. He's now working with the House Intelligence Committee, the Fox, guarding that house as information comes in about Edwin Wilson to see what comes in. And also, in case he gets tangled in any of the witnesses talking, he has to be out of office. And Alexander Haig stepped out because of the role with Licio Gelli, with Roberto Calvi, with NATO, with the plans for fascism in Italy. They didn't step down as moderates, and the New York Times is trying to give them the role as being moderate people in the administration when there's nobody further right than Bobby Inman and Alexander Haig. We'll take a break now, and I'll be back with you in 1 minute. This is Mae Brussell at KAZU-FM.
KZU, Pacific Grove.
Okay, this is side 2. This is Mae Brussell, KAZU in Pacific Grove, California. Article in Covert Action this week. It comes out 4 times a year, I guess it is. I lose track. Summer 1982, the administration of Ronald Reagan is going to increase covert action of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he has what he called a Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. I mention this because in covert action, they listed Alfred S. Bloomingdale, former head of Diners Club, as being on the board of the intelligence operation, and Richard Allen, formerly Reagan's national security advisor, will be a part-time consultant to the board. Now, Mr. Bloomingdale is the fellow who's having a little trouble with Vicki Morgan, her $18,000 a month funds were cut off, and I suggested that she was more into espionage than even the whips and chains and the kinky sex, and this was a perfect way to, the funds, I believe, were cut off when Roberto Calvi was hung in Italy, that a lot of espionage money is going to be cut off that would have come through other routes, that she'll be paid off by a lawsuit, but temporarily her money was cut off. So these are the kind of people that Ronald Reagan has, people with double lives, double wives, sadomasochism. This is his very fine Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and Alfred Bloomingdale is one of those characters on the board. There's an open letter in the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner this last week that sort of paraphrased what I was trying to say about John Schmitz and Alfred Bloomingdale and what I called high society. But they brought out, the author of this particular open letter brought out the fact of the hypocrisy of John Schmitz making fun of the hippie generation, the free love, the communal hippie be-ins or whatever during the 60s and later in the 70s, putting down young people doing their thing. And this person wrote an open letter saying, I'm really surprised at you. You claim you're a devout Catholic, you read the Bible, you have this intemperate view of other people, you're so impatient, you've had a wife for 28 years, now you have a mistress going the same time, and then you have a son and a daughter-in-law who are the godparents of your love child. And the author said, of the letter said, you're presiding over a regular free love-in like the 60s, and how come, John, you're putting down the young generation, and you're doing everything they did and more, having double families and getting them all involved in these particular activities of yours, so that the people that are passing such strict criticism or opinions about other people, I think a little more scrutiny, and we'd find that they have their own problems at home. I didn't want to pass up an article that I have pulled for primary notice. It's in the Washington Post, and I didn't want to pass it up. It was July the 11th, 1982, and it's called The Document That Sowed the Seed of Haig's Demise. Now, the reason this Fritz KRAEMER is so important that I keep mentioning him is that Fritz KRAEMER is the real godfather of Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And this article in the Washington Post has a letter that Alexander Haig gave Ronald Reagan when he was going to become president. It was dated January the 6th, 1981, and the inauguration wasn't until the 21st. And in the letter, he says he will make various decisions, and he said, as your Secretary of State, I will be the vicar for the community departments and foreign policy. I will be your vicar, with a capital V. And he said, well, he listed some of the things that he would be doing, and one of them would be food policy, a particularly valuable instrument of foreign policy in the years ahead. Now, that is one of the things that many presidents tried to stay away from, and it's one of the things that Reinhard Gehlen, the mentor of Alexander Haig, wanted. He wanted, as soon as World War II is over, to starve 40 million people in 1 week, Reinhard Gehlen. That's the fellow that was knighted by the Vatican about 2 months later and made a Knight of Malta and flown to the United States as soon as the war was over. His first goal, as soon as he had control of the continent of Europe, was to starve 40 million people within 1 week, just round them up and starve them to death. Forget the gas chambers. So in this memo where Haig is presenting to the soon-to-be President of the United States, he says, I will be your vicar and I will use food as a policy. Then he lists upcoming events of importance that he will have to attend to. This is Alexander Haig, the protege of Fritz KRAEMER, the man from the Pentagon, not the State Department. He made State Department policy, but the man who had so much influence over Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. And he has upcoming events for the president. This is dated January the 6th, but just came out recently in the Washington Post. Number one visit was a Korean visit with Kim Dae-jung, and that is a coup that took place where he killed the person that he worked with right at the dinner table, and the subject of that murder is part of that book, The Circle, the murder of the Korean president. So the next assassin is the first person invited to the White House for the President of the United States when he's inaugurated. The second guest, February 17th, was to be the King and Queen of Spain. Now, that was a fascist coup of the Nazis retrenching after World War II that didn't take place. A few people were charged. They tried even another coup after that. The CIA and the United States were behind that one. And Haig was arranging the dinner for the King and Queen of Spain, even though he was planning for their removal and a coup in the country at the same time. And the third party would be with the French foreign minister, and fourth, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher was working with Roberto Calvi and the NATO group from Italy, Licio Gelli, and Alexander Haig, and they were planning a fascist coup in Italy. The CIA had planned military intervention in Italy from 1946 on. They were going to send in troops in 1976. So when they entertained Margaret Thatcher, they were planning a coup. Almost simultaneously, the story broke in May about the plans to turn Italy into a fascist Nazi country, the way the CIA did in Greece, but luckily it was overturned after a few years, and there was plenty of torture and pain in that interim when the United States put a coup into Greece that didn't hold, but what if it had? And we were trying to throw these other countries into a coup. Now, he has here a contingency plan for Poland. That's the next thing on his list. Well, between February and Poland was the shooting of Ronald Reagan in March, and that little episode took place in March of 1981, and then a contingency plan for Poland. Now, that was a coup that didn't take place either. There weren't very many successes, and if some of you feel despondent about the news and you think things are going all wrong, keep in mind what was planned and didn't take place, and be glad it didn't happen and the plans are falling apart. The Korean coup had taken place, but the Spanish one didn't. The United States didn't when Haig was going to take over and be in command, in charge here. The Italian one didn't, and Licio Gelli had to flee the country, and the Polish coup instigating the Soviet Union to come in and have a confrontation didn't take place. But the very important issues of January the 6th that Haig presented to the President of the United States as the new Secretary of State, as his vicar, he refers to himself, I will be your vicar, with a Korean visit, the King and Queen of Spain, Margaret Thatcher, the plans for Poland, etc. So Haig has a lot of power, and that's why, again, I keep going into the Fritz KRAEMER story. Now, one newspaper, the LA Herald Examiner, June the 19th, had the story about Bobby Inman leaving as deputy director of the CIA to work for the Democratic-controlled House Select Committee on Intelligence. Well, one of the things that this author mentioned who wrote The Circle was that Edwin Wilson will never come to trial. Edwin Wilson is the entire American assassination era, from the U-2 flights to the Kennedy assassination, the Bay of Pigs, up through the murder of Sadat in Egypt. Edwin Wilson is in this country now, but he will never come to trial. And while the House Intelligence Committee is working, the advisor to it is their part-time consultant, is now Mr. Inman, deputy director of the CIA, who headed Edwin Wilson's team. This is similar to Bernard Fensterwald, the attorney who formed the committee to investigate assassinations. And while he worked with the various researchers, he was the attorney for James Earl Ray and for Mitchell Werbel and Irv Davidson and the other side, the assassination teams and the assassination researchers. Well, Inman is now advising the House, and everything that Wilson says will be top secret. So very little will come out of that trial. They'll have a way of getting him out. Now, there's an organization called Western Goals that I want to mention because Roy Cohn has joined this organization. Roy Cohn has been trouble for a long time. Incidentally, he was just in San Francisco at the National Convention, the American Bar Association. They had Alexander Haig there and Roy Cohn, and somebody brought in a pig with the name Roy painted on it and took it out of the room. Roy Cohn has been appointed to Western Goals. Alfred Bloomingdale is on the House Intelligence Committee of Ronald Reagan, and Roy Cohn is part of Western Goals. Now, that has been going for 3 years, set up by Larry MacDonald from Georgia. And also on this group is the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, and Roger Milliken from North Carolina, the textile executive. Now, one of the things we have to watch for the next 2 years, and I'll be talking about it maybe every week mentioning, is the Olympic Games in Los Angeles. That is a place to plan a coup in this country, again, if they want to. This country is going to build up the terrorism shtick, the garden plot that Ronald Reagan was in on when he was governor of the United States, the plans to take over the United States, to end the kind of democracy that we have. This Larry MacDonald is the fellow I've mentioned from Georgia who is linked to Mr. Habash in Beirut, Lebanon, and into Chile with the assassination teams coming out of the Mitchell Ward Bell training camp in Georgia, the same bases that Mark David Chapman was located, the fellow that killed John Lennon. Larry MacDonald should be investigated for the allegations and charges that Robert Byron Watson made of his working with the international assassination teams. Now, this is a fellow working with the terrorists, making the left, making the right wing look like the left. And when he teams up with Roy Cohn, one of the original people that promoted Senator Joe McCarthy, that worked with the Nazis out of Malmedy, with the FRITZ, KRAEMER, Kissinger, Haig group, when they team up and put Roy Cohn on the board of their anti-communist group, there are a whole circle of organizations getting set now that are trouble. They've been trouble from the early 50s and the Breaking America part with the House Un-American Activities, and they're still out looking for communists, while all the evidence is that the terrorism is being funded from the right. But when divergent people merge, such as Roy Cohn, working out of law offices in New York City and with members of the organized crime syndicate such as the Genovese, the Cosa Nostra, the Gambinos, and Senator Joe McCarthy, the Nazi element, the far right-wing element, when he begins working with Teller, you see, it's like the book review of The Circle. You get the military intelligence, people like Mr. Teller, Edward Teller, and your hydrogen bombs. You get your terrorists like Mr. MacDonald, Representative MacDonald, working with the counterintelligence, Roy Cohn with the crime syndicate and the political smear group. They all merge together, not only in novels such as The Circle, and he's referring to Reverend Moon and Kissinger and the Korean connections and the mafia connections in the White House, but this Eastern group, a different segment, is coming together and forming committees, and we have to watch these committees. Now, this past week, there were 18 very important articles on the financial crisis in Italy. In the last 3 weeks, I've been talking about the murder of Roberto Calvi and the effect it is going to have on banking institutions. I can't share in 15 minutes all 18 articles, but I want to mention some of the important articles that are out in case you want to read them. I have them on the sheet that accompanies this tape. If you listen on the air, you can write to me. Incidentally, it's Post Office Box 22511, Mae Brussell, Carmel 93922. And if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope and ask for sheets from particular broadcasts, I will send you the bibliography and the source of information that I have that goes with each of these cassettes. People that subscribe to the cassettes get the sheets automatically, but if you tape this off the air and want the bibliography, all you have to do is write to me and I'll send them to you. Now, the New Solidarity newspaper, July 12th, 1982, has a long article, half a page, Central Banks Cover for Crime and Terrorism. And this is about the Italian Banco Ambrosiano, the network of the Italian judges in Italy accusing the various bankers that are going under right now of funding crime networks, of working with terrorism, of gun running, of using financiers for terrorism, and simulating organizations such as the Red Brigades and so forth. This article is about the Bank of England and the Bank of Italy, and Margaret Thatcher running to Rome last week, running off, and Warren Burger, our Chief Justice, was in Rome. There's a lot of running around, and it's about the institute in Basel called the Bank for International Settlements, and how the banks in London and the banks in Italy are in Basel now trying to figure out what to do with their losses, as much as $20 billion worth of capital funneled out of Italy alone, and also those problems in Great Britain. 4 major banks are having the same problem in Great Britain. Another long article in the New York Times, July the 18th, 1982, checks and imbalances at the Vatican Bank. And it goes into the missing millions and billions. And this article is by Malachi Martin. It said there is enough intrigue to fill a series of spy novels. And he has written some wonderful books on this subject. And this article, he says, how much money has disappeared and where has it gone? This will bring plenty of questions. And, of course, that is where I want to see where the money has gone. He refers to transferring Vatican money into corporations such as Chase Manhattan, General Foods, General Electric, Shell Gasoline, Standard Oil, and so forth. In 1972, when I published my first article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, I used the example of Pershing Gervais. It was the back of the Realist article, how Pershing Gervais was coaxed by John Mitchell to try and frame Jim Garrison with a phony arrest in 1971 because Garrison was working on the Kennedy assassination. And then Pershing went to Canada and decided to come home. And he was given a phony minister's permit to work in Canada. Then he was given an alias. Then his birth certificate for him and his family. Then he was hired by an oil company in Vancouver, and the money came out of General Motors in Detroit. He got $18,000 a year. Well, there's inflation now. Vicki Morgan gets $18,000 a month, so you can see how much inflation there is. Finally, he couldn't stand it there, and his child didn't like it, and his wife, and he came home and he exposed the government. But the point is that these huge institutions pour money into something like General Motors or these big companies, General Foods, and then they write the paycheck and put the spies or the people who framed men like Jim Garrison or political assassins, they put them on the payroll, and it looked like they're paid by General Motors, and the money was coming right out of institutions such as the Vatican, and you weren't supposed to know it, except that the banks are emptied now, and people are asking, where did it go? The London Times has a marvelous article, Sunday, July 18th, 1982. There's 3 sentences in there. I envy the writing style of some of these people. I can't equal it, but I can paraphrase it. I just want to read 3 sentences from the London Times on this question. It's called Bankers Choke on Ambrosia. And this is what Graham Sargent writes. He says, for the world's high-dealing international bankers, and our big 4, those are the 4 biggest in London, are all prominent on the list. The past fortnight has produced one piece of bad news after another. Only the Machiavellian cross-section sliced through the tangled affairs of Italy's Banco Ambrosiano has really made the headlines. Banco Ambrosiano has only made the headlines, so can you imagine the 4 biggest banks in London and J.P. Morgan and Chase Manhattan this week were transferring money to London, and the London Times had an article, wait till the Americans find out that J.P. Morgan and Aetna Insurance are taking it out of this country to cover the losses there. This article goes on to say that only the Ambrosiano has broken yet, but the 4 big banks in England are involved. But taken together, this article says, these various strands will exert even greater strain on the world liquidity and threaten world trade recovery. They refer to the Midland Bank and the National Westminster Bank, the defaulting of the Luxembourg subsidiary, and hundreds of millions of dollars gone. And then it says, after earlier collapses, leading central banks joined together in Basel Concordat to smooth out their fears. And this is where they met in Basel, Switzerland, to find out what they should do and the real money worries and the major problems. I bring this up because they talk about the money they lost in going into Poland, the money in Argentina, the money in Turkey and Mexico. They've taken tremendous loans, and the money has gone down the drain, and there's no way to get it back. They've given it out in the hopes of promoting fascism. But the people don't want to overthrow their leaders. They're incapable of doing it, or they don't care to. It was the same way that we worked so hard and put so much time and money into landing at the Bay of Pigs, thinking everybody would raise their hands again and say, welcome. People didn't object to Fidel Castro that much. The same thing happened when Germany went into Russia, into the Soviet Union. They were sure when they got there that the Russians would pour out, leave the communist countries. They didn't think they would let 7 or 8 million die defending one city and saying, go home. The people stood and died and defended what they had in preference to Nazi Germany. And we have taken our money from American banks and put it into the European banks, and they have given it to countries, and we've given loans where there's no possible way to pay them back. And eventually the American banks, such as the Continental Bank and the Franklin and the Drysdale and Chase Manhattan, lost $30 million last week, and they're still sending money over to England. Something is going to happen, and also, again, the California banks. Another article, the Vatican banker to stand trial. This is the Banca Privata Italiano. Luigi Manini is to stand trial with 25 others for the losses in that bank. 2 of the men of the 25 have disappeared. One, Mr. Oliveira, in Switzerland, and another out of Scotland. 2 of the 25 are gone. Wall Street Journal, July 26, Italians will continue the Calvi probe despite the ruling of suicide. They believe he was murdered. They want to find the murderers. They don't believe that Roberto Calvi hung from the bridge the way they said he did, and they still want to go into the ownership of the Panama banks. If we only knew the dummy fronts down there and where the money went, it would tell us a lot of how huge corporations have used a religious institution to set up dummy fronts. And I keep bringing this up, week after week with new articles, because the scandal of hiring terrorism and assassination teams, planning military coups, planning the killing of Orlando Letelier, any politician or congressman or newspaper person who stands for the people, or person such as those 5 millionaires I listed at the beginning of the program that go flying out of windows, that are found shot outside their homes. There is so much havoc and there's so much intensity to cover this up that more people are dying, and it's going to get harder to cover because there's this reckless killing now. And I spent last night about 5 hours just typing the main murder stories of the week and decided to save them for another program. But there are so many. A guard outside the Kennedy Center in Boston, Sammy Davis Jr.'s guard out front of his house. Movie actors, Mr. Morrow, the set there, and animation, that is tangled affair, and the William Holden will. It goes on and on. They asked for investigation into Atlanta, Georgia, again, opening. They don't believe that Wayne Williams did all those murders. I typed maybe 20 pages of just 1 week's stories of cases being reopened. The CIA killing Marilyn Monroe, LAPD ready to go into the Belushi case again. There is a madness, and there's a common denominator going through this. And the trick is to find out who is doing the killing, who's paying the bucks. And if they're hiding behind something so horrendous as religious institutions, and one as large as that makes it worse. And when they empty the major banks of Europe, the German banks and the Italian and the English, and they find out all that money is gone out of the country to Nazi organizations in Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, getting ready for a real takeover. When you find that is happening, it is very serious. And that is, in essence, where the money has gone and has been traced, and they've admitted it. And finally, the last article that's so important, a spreading mystery of the Italian bank scandal. This is the New York Times, a Paul Lewis story, July 27th, a full page. And it goes into the Chase Manhattan Bank denying their agreement with the Vatican on missing money and pouring $500 million credit, arranging for the Vatican Bank. They bring in the Chase Manhattan into this story and the Roman Catholic Church. And this article begins with the God's banker, Roberto Calvi, being found dead, similar to that Wall Street Journal story of the attorney from Toronto being thrown out the window in April. It says it's sending shock waves throughout the world of international finance and raising questions of current efforts to regulate the multinational banks. In such scandals, the New York Times says there are unverifiable reports of organized crime figures, anti-government secrets. The British Secret Service suspects the Italians of funding the Argentine arms purchases during the war in the Falklands. You see, I said that visitor with the Queen had more to do with the Falklands and the missing millions, that there was some message of a kind that he was allowed to know which room and when to go to speak with her. And right after that, she was put in the hospital for the first time in her life and whisked away to Windsor Castle. The New York Times article goes into, again, 400 million missing here, 1.2 billion missing there, and the scandal that the Italians were funding the weapons to fight the British in the Falklands, that it was going down to the Argentine government and out of the West German Herstatt Bank, and again, the meeting in Basel, Switzerland. On the darker side, this article says, of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, rumors abound, but facts are scarce. Mr. Calvi was mentioned in May as part of the Masonic Lodge. That was a secret group in Italy that planned the Nazi takeover of Italy in May, that planned to kill the king and queen of Spain earlier in the year, and had Ronald Reagan's assassination attempt. It had nothing to do with Jodie Foster. They had this little neo-Nazi traveling around, and he'll be out of jail in about 6 months. The New York Times says that towards the end of his life, Mr. Calvi was suspected of being with underworld figures, lent Peru $200 million to buy secret missiles for the Argentine Air Force during the Falkland War. No wonder they hung him off of a bridge in London and called it a suicide. And this article goes into the scandal of the missing money in Luxembourg owed to Great Britain, the British banks that are in trouble. This is a full-page article of a outwork of the money change. It's a chart of the money change in the Ambrosiano scandal, going from Milan to private banks, to Luxembourg, to subsidiaries in Latin America, to the Bahamas, and the Vatican and the Panamanian companies. Now, these countries that I mentioned, like Peru, Argentina, England, seem scattered, but the main thing that's happening in Europe is that the major nations like the United States and Great Britain and our 250 banks have funded countries that took huge loans that they can't pay back. They can't pay back the interest, and they can't begin to ever pay the loans back. So we have to, as taxpayers, assume those loans that our country gave to these people. And the money is not accounted for. And the murders are going on, and the assassinations of the witnesses who could talk are going on, and the money's going down to South America for weapons and missile systems. So the scandal of using institutions such as the church, or murdering primary witnesses, linking them to the underworld, is the essence of The Circle. That book, that this new book that came out on The Circle, talks about the use of the underworld, the use of assassination teams, of elected officials in Washington, unelected officials. And the main thing I think we have to always look for is to break this chain of theirs, to demand that somebody be accountable for this. If it isn't Ronald Reagan, get a president up for nomination who will be accountable. And if a candidate comes through, pin him on these questions. What will you do? Now, I'm going to write to Ronald Reagan this week and ask about Helene von Damm, how he can put a Nazi female in charge of the White House appointments, which he's done. He did in Sacramento, and he moved her to Washington, and find out what bank Mr. von Damm, Christian von Damm, belongs to in Germany, because this, again, affects that article. I believe the Arctic Circle scandal, the German banks, that I'll go into next week. It's a tangled affair. I'm glad that some authors are coming out with books that have the totality of it, because then I think you can see better what I've been trying to show, the little pieces. There are some major books out now linking all of these forces, and the forces are coming out in the newspaper. I've got a pile here of evidence that they are coming out every day, the interconnecting links finally. Well, this is Mae Brussell. That's enough to absorb for 1 week, I believe. Do your homework and read your books and newspapers, and I'll be back with you next week. This is KAZU